Kimo for a joint event we're hosting with our friends from CPT and WPI Economics. Now, so that's SMF, WPI, CPT. If anyone plays Scrabble out there and can beat the 5-letter word I can make out of our shared acronyms, I will give you a prize at the end of this. But no, so that's three of us. We are here to talk about decarbonisation dividend on buses. Before I introduce the panel and the running order, I need to do some quick housekeeping, just to say from the perspective of the venue, in the event there is a fire alarm, there are no planned fire alarms this morning, so if anyone does talk about fires, the exits over there. I think that's the only bit of housekeeping I do. Normally have to say, please put yourselves on mute, and we will be recording this session, but we're slowly returning to the real world. So remember, this is in fact not a Zoom call, which is very nice. In terms of the running order of the morning, in a second I'll hand over to Graham Vidler, the Chief Executive of the Confederation of Passenger Transport, who will talk to you about the project we're here to discuss. He in turn will pass to Matthew Oakley from WPI Economics, who, Matt, just to confuse things, Matt, as well as running WPI Economics, is also a senior researcher at the Social Market Foundation, hence the crossover of our acronyms. Then we'll get some thoughts from Helena Bennett from the Green Alliance, and we finally have the magisterial upsong from the Minister Charlotte Vere, who promises me she's not in fact about to launch a last-minute bid for the Tory leadership, but maybe if we all ask her very nicely, she might change her mind about that. You're probably aware that in hot, sweaty rooms across Westminster this morning, people are fulminating and plotting, but we are delighted to be separate from that and to have much better air conditioning than them. So that's about all from me. After we've heard from all the panelists, we will all have a chance to ask questions and poke and problem and interrogate the research and the wider problem agenda. So we will get to that. Now, anyway, so that's, I was seeing, sorry, forgive me, my right hand was reaching for the mute button. I was literally about to say, I'm going to put myself on mute now and hand over to Greg, because I've been doing too many Zoom calls the last couple of years. So I'm not going to mute myself, I'm just going to stay quiet while Graham talks. Graham.
Thank you very much, James. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to those joining on our live stream this morning as well. On behalf of the CPT, I'd like to say how proud I am to be sponsoring this important piece of research. Really great to see how it's progressing so far. And today's event and the project as a whole really is really all about how millions of small changes can add up to make one essential big change. Because I think the research is pretty clear that if we're to stay on course to meet the nation's net zero targets, we need to change the way we travel a little bit. We need to take fewer carbon-intensive car journeys and start using less carbon-intensive modes, walking, cycling, and of course public transport a little bit more. And the good news is that from a bus and coach perspective, and that obviously is the focus of today's session, it's a really small change that can drive that big change. A couple of journeys per driver per month, switched from car to bus or coach. That's it. And as Matt will show later on in his presentation, I'm sure, the benefits of those changes aren't just decarbonisation benefits. There are huge changes to our economic well-being, to our health, to our local communities. So it's a really, really huge prize that's within reach if people can be encouraged and able to make those small changes. And I think the really good news is, in parallel to the work that Matt and team at WPI have been doing, we've been running a consumer poll in recent weeks. One of the things that tells us is that around about 2/3 of drivers say they want to get a better mix between their use of their car and their use of public transport. So at a headline in principle level, people are really up for it, really ready to make that change. The other thing I want to emphasise is that today is the start of this journey. It's not the end of the journey. So today we're going to set out the opportunity and the scale of the prize that's within our grasp. After that, we'll launch into a series of roundtables over the summer, led by James and the team at the SMF, where we'll take a really hard look with colleagues from central and local government, from across civil society and from across the industry how we need to change in order to enable people to fulfill their best intentions and actually move that small number of car journeys over to more sustainable modes. All of that will culminate in a policy report in November of this year, which we hope will come up with some prescriptions for future success. So it's really the start of a journey today. It's a journey that's absolutely necessary. It's a journey that I and the rest of the team at CPT are hugely excited about. And it's a journey that starts with the fantastic research that WPI have been doing for us over the last few months. So let me hand over to Matt to talk you through it.
Super, thank you very much. And great to see everyone here and to be speaking at an in-person event for the first time, I think, for a couple of years. So lovely to be here. So as Graham was saying, we were commissioned earlier this year to think about the role that switching car journeys to bus and coach could have in terms of the country's net zero ambitions. This is very much, as was already said, the first part of that. So this is the why. This is the kind of the benefits of that, or the why we should be doing that. The next stage will then go on to talk about the how. So in terms of the why, this is basically the 30-40 page report in one slide. So I made it stop here, but basically moving journeys from car to bus and coach, we summarise as being necessary to ensure a just transition to net zero, desirable because it has a multi-dimensional set of benefits beyond decarbonisation and net zero, and also possible in terms of, as Graham was saying, there is appetite there to move journeys and be more sustainable in terms of how we are taking forward our transport choices. I'm going to talk through each of those in a bit of detail, hopefully fairly quickly, and give you some, I guess, the headlines of what our modelling and research has shown in terms of the scale of some of those benefits. First of all, why is modal shift necessary? You're all here today, so I'm assuming you know this, that the UK's net zero requirements really require a significant, a decarbonisation of the surface transport sector. This is the country's largest emitter of greenhouse gases and the only one whose emissions have increased since 1990. This is a really, really significant challenge. Of course, we know that electric vehicles are becoming more popular and more common these days. But as the CCC and others have said, technological change on its own is not going to get us to where we need to be to deliver on net zero. What we also need is modal shift, shifting car journeys to more sustainable forms of transport, including bus and coach. The upshot of that is that, in short, the UK is not going to meet its net zero ambitions without making that shift, without shifting some car journeys to bus and coach in the future. It's also not just about net zero. It's also about how we achieve it. A really important part of this is that we argue that delivering net zero, contributing to net zero through this modal shift to bus and coach, is about delivering net zero in a more equitable, in a fairer way. If we're not relying on new electric vehicles for everybody, it's a cheaper transition, and those savings are felt more keenly by those on the lowest income. So this is a way of delivering a fairer, more equitable, just transition to net zero. So that's why it's necessary. How about desirable? We talked there about some of the potential environmental benefits and also about some of the societal benefits in terms of equity. We also identify another set of different benefits. We go into in more detail in the report, but so do take away and have a look at those. Essentially, environmental as well as the carbon emissions, we identify air quality improvements, significant health benefits, both from increased physical activity, psychological well-being, reduced road noise, reduced car accidents, so significant benefits there, alongside those societal benefits that I've already talked about. So really a wide range of benefits alongside those environmental benefits that we focus on mainly in this report. So it's desirable, it's beneficial. what might actually then be achievable. What our report does is take three different scenarios, and I appreciate this is probably the world's smallest chart you see in the seventh row. But have a look at the report. Essentially, we put together three scenarios of what we think might be sensibly achievable. Each of those is consistent with the CCC's balanced pathway to net zero. Our central case sees bus patronage in GB increased by more than 80% in 2050. That sounds like quite a big overall number, but as Graham's saying, actually, very small changes individually add up to that very big number. So we're just talking about just over 2 car trips per month per person by 2050. So a relatively small change here, which we think, based on the evidence we've seen, is achievable. We think it's conservative and a sensible way of looking at some of the benefits from this. So what would that lead to? First of all, decarbonisation. We see a significant direct contribution here. We know that well-designed and effective bus priority measures cut greenhouse gases as compared to travelling by car. We know, for instance, that previous evidence is showing that travelling, for instance, from Cardiff to Manchester by coach produces around 1/4 of the emissions per passenger than the typical car might do. And we use those sorts of estimates to understand what that modal shift, that's our central case of modal shift, would lead to in terms of greenhouse gas reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. Cumulatively, that is around 19.5 million tonne reduction in CO2 by 2050, 15.8 of that from local buses and 3.7 million of that from coaches. They sound like quite big numbers. They are quite big numbers, but to contextualise that, that is in total more than the entire CO2 emissions of the North East in 2019. So this is a sizable reduction in CO2 emissions. There are also indirect contributions here, both in terms of reducing congestion, so the economic benefits of that, and also improving the investment case for investments in zero-emission buses and coaches. So alongside those decarbonisation benefits, there's also air quality benefits. These are felt across the depth and breadth of Great Britain. Some figures there again in the main report, but a headline of the value of these air quality benefits around £28 million, enough to pay for 800 nurses for a year in the NHS. So really quite significant benefits there. Bigger still, I think we estimate are the health benefits. We estimate these coming through two main sources: lifestyle benefits, for instance, the increased physical activity, and then reductions in noise and road traffic accidents. We estimate those to be around £15 billion, the equivalent of enough to build 33 new NHS hospitals. The majority of those coming from reduction in road traffic accidents because of reduction in car use. So around 9 billion of those coming from that source. So again, quite significant, quite significant benefits. Finally, we know there are socioeconomic benefits of modal shift. Increase in local bus connectivity has been shown previously to reduce income and employment deprivation and to increase skills amongst a whole host of different local benefits. The report looks only at the potential benefits of a reduction in congestion and finds those to amount to close to £30 billion by 2050. Again, to contextualise that, that's more than the GDP of Manchester in 2019. So hopefully that convinces you that modal shift is necessary, desirable and possible. And Andrew's going to be pretty pleased that I remembered those three words, which I've written down here, which I've been struggling with all morning. The question then is, how can we make this a reality? I think the positive news, as Graham's already said, that the general public already identifies the negative consequences of too much car use and appears to be willing to switch to buses. We also know that from across the country, the research we've done so far, that there are some local success stories of that already happening. So very much the next stage of this work is to explore some of those, to work with you and others, other stakeholders, to try and understand how we might actually deliver these benefits and move people from car to bus and coach. Already we've been thinking as up there of some of the routes to that. We've thought about carrots, we're thinking about sticks, and thinking about nudges. If you have any ideas, we'd be really, really pleased to hear them. Please contact us. We are all ears and looking to get the widest range of input into that work as possible. But for now, I will leave you with the case that it is necessary, desirable, and possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So at that point, I should briefly interrupt you on the point of engagement, just to underline that we will be running a series of roundtables with CPT and WPI over the next few weeks. Some of you probably invited those already, others of you may be dragging into those after this session. But also on the engagement point, I should have mentioned earlier on that camera over there, as Graham alluded to earlier, is currently live streaming this event to YouTube. So we should also say hello to our online viewers, both in real time and in the future, because some people will in fact watch this event again in their own time later in the day. So we should say that I encourage them to engage as well. That's just also just by way of reminder when we get to the question section, bear in mind that as well as speaking to all of your friends in this room, you're also speaking to the internet out there on that camera. So and the recording of the session will stay up there on YouTube for all time. So your immortality is guaranteed via this session this morning. But I'll now pass over to some more immortal words from Helen from Greenlight.
Hi everyone, nice to see you all in person. My name is Helena Bennett. I'm head of climate policy at Green Alliance. I'm not going to give you another acronym, we are just Green Alliance. If you aren't aware of what we do or what our work revolves around, we are an independent think tank and charity. We work across climate and environment policy areas. We do a mixture of kind of classic think tank stuff, research and analysis, as well as quite a lot of political engagement and advocacy, and convening is quite a big part of what we do as well. One of the areas that we focus quite heavily on from a climate point of view is transport decarbonisation, for obvious reasons. As Matt alluded to, it's the highest polluting sector in the UK, and surface transport is a big focus of what we do because it's the highest polluting subsector of transport. Last December, we published a report called Not Going the Extra Mile, which outlined some different scenarios of uptake rates of electric vehicles, essentially up to 2030, and found that even with ambitious uptake rates, we would still need to see a decrease of 20 to 27% in the number of car miles driven by 2030. That report essentially laid kind of the groundwork for what we're now doing on a separate piece of work, thinking about how we can achieve that reduction in car miles driven. And you'll be very pleased to know that we are linked up with what WPI's work is doing. So really, really happy that there's lots of different conversations about this going on. And when I've chatted to Matt's colleagues before, we're always saying, why hasn't this been done before? So it's great to know that it's being done specifically for buses and coaches. And the reason that I'm really glad it's happening for buses and coaches, and buses in particular, is because, again, as has already been mentioned, they are such a great mode of transport for everybody, and especially, really pertinently at the moment, upping the number of bus services, their reliability, their accessibility, and reducing fares is such an impactful way of addressing the cost of living crisis. We've got huge fuel prices at the moment. There are pledges left, right, and centre about cutting fuel duty, which is potentially one method that candidates in the current Tory leadership race are swinging towards. But actually, there's lots of other things we can be doing to help address costs that people are facing right now. And delivering better bus services is such a quick, actually, and easy win that we are really trying to push for. So I'm really, really glad this piece of work is happening. We know that the public really want to see action on climate change. I'm sure you've all seen the news recently and all the kind of polling and stuff that's been done about how much Tory party members especially wants to see action on climate. There was some polling from Onward recently that showed that they could be losing 1.3 million voters in the next election if climate and net zero falls down the agenda, which is really worrying. And sometimes I think we, as a kind of green movement, forget that a lot of these policies that we talk about to reduce emissions massively help address the cost of living crisis. And so I'm really, really pleased that there's a whole kind of economic and social benefits section in this report as well. I think it's incredibly positive and really good hook for a lot of us to use in the work that we do going forward. So, I mean, I won't go on much longer, just there's a couple of things policy-wise I think we can see, immediately, and I know that will be addressed in the second part of this report, so that's it's really great. There's a big driver shortage for buses at the moment, which needs to be thought about really quickly. We need to make sure we're helping local authorities deliver on what they want to do with local bus services. I know there's some guidance on local transport plans coming soon. And I have yet to hear if it's confirmed from the Department of Transport, so I don't know if they can get that today, but there is a story going around that bus fares are going to be capped at £2 per journey, even for longer distance journeys, which would be an incredible thing to have, a really good lever to pull to encourage people back onto buses. Patronage is at an all-time low. The number of miles driven by buses as a percentage of overall journeys has decreased in recent years. We know, I don't know if you've seen the results of what happened in Germany with the €9 fares for a month of free public transport. Patronage across public transport has absolutely rocketed, which will in turn reduce emissions and reduce congestion and improve air pollution, etc. And we know that the two biggest barriers to getting people back on public transport are costs and our access and reliability of services. So combining action on both those fronts, I think, will help alleviate cost of living, increase social mobility, and importantly, reduce emissions as well.
Thank you very much. Speaking as a retired recovering journalist, I should say I'm trying to put the minister on the spot there and get a story out on fee categories. So don't remember that one. I was going to say, in my old life as a journalist, I used to spend a lot of time with politicians, and I used to reflect on the fact that both politicians and journalists don't talk anywhere near enough about buses, which may well be the issue we end up talking about here today. So in that context, I'm especially pleased to have here a minister and a politician who really wants to talk about buses. And not boring politics and all the scheming and backstabbing going on elsewhere in this basket today. So with that, I will hand over to Minister the Baroness Vere.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm also really delighted to be a member of the House of Lords, so I don't have to worry about all that nonsense that's going on down the other end. I will just take whatever I'm given and we'll see where we get to. So I've been the Minister for Roads, Buses and Transport and Places for, 3 years, which is quite a long time really for a Transport Minister. And over that time, we have come such a long way in terms of our thinking about buses. If I think back to where we were when I started my job, we really didn't think about buses very much at all. And we have come a long way. The National Bus Strategy, which you all know, we published in March last year. And actually, even since the publication of the National Bus Strategy, we have put local transport authorities through their paces by requiring them to do various things. And they've really had to get their skates on. And I'm really, really pleased that a lot of them, actually all of them, did. But unfortunately, some of them were not quite as high quality as one would like. But we are in a good place in understanding what our networks look like countrywide. We know what patronage is looking like. We know actually that it's very variable by location and also by time of day. So any sense that we can suddenly just go back to the pre-pandemic network and say it's all right, that's job done, it's not going to happen, because life has changed. And we absolutely need to plan for the future and be prepared to make our bus networks, wherever they are, fit for the future. So that's what the government's very much focused on. And I see my role in government as being, government of enabling. I want to enable the industry to do, what it can to improve the transport network, particularly in buses. And I'm delighted that WPI has concluded that, the modal shift is necessary, desirable, and possible. That's absolutely fantastic. So if we've got that from the public, and that's what we think we can make happen, it's up to me now to put in place all of those things which will provide the framework around which this will all happen. And you'll say, oh, that's all very government speak, isn't it? Well, I mean, I suppose it is, because at the end of the day, we in government have to deal with our local transport authorities, because they're our delivery partners. I cannot, from Westminster, plan bus routes. It would be utterly mad. But what I can do from Westminster is I can give lots of money to places with really high local ambitions for good quality bus services. And that is precisely what we have done. And now some people say, oh, well, not everywhere got some money. No, quite right. Some of the B6 were simply not good enough. And so what we need to do in this sort of short to medium term is give money to those places that really had the best plans, focusing very much on bus priority and also cheap and simple fares. Those are the two things that we think will have the biggest and quickest impact on our buses. And so that's what we want to do, and we want to find out from those areas that we are able to give funding to, what works and what doesn't. And that is one of the key parts of the National Bus Strategy, but also in why we provided the funding in the manner that we did, is that so places learn from each other. So when I was deciding how we were going to split up the BSIP funding, I looked at how ambitious each BSIP was. I then looked at obviously the assessment versus the published guidance, as one most properly should. I also looked at population. But then I thought, okay, well, have I stuffed up here? Have I given all the money to a certain type of local authority? So then we went back to first principles. We looked at every single transport authority, and I checked levels of deprivation. I checked levels of car ownership and also regional spread. And there's something else, but I'm too blind, I can't see it. But those are the three key things that we looked at to make sure that we were funding different types of places. And lo and behold, remarkably, we were. Which also goes to show that it doesn't matter what type of local transport authority you are, you can produce a high quality and decent BSIP. So that's where we are at the moment. We've provided those buckets of funding. Obviously, final allocations will be subject to them providing a really good summary of where they're going to put the cash. And then we really need delivery. So, very much in the Department for Transport, you've seen, we've got loads of strategies out there, loads of visions, transport decarbonisation plan, etc. We are now all about the delivery, because if we cannot deliver better buses on the basis of, quite frankly, a lot of money, £3 billion, then there must be something deeply wrong with this country. So I'm sure we can do it. I'm hoping that I keep my job, but who knows? Because I have enjoyed doing it, and I look forward to continuing to work with CPT and everyone else in the bus sector for as long as possible.
Thank you very much. Before we have quick questions from the audience in a second, I have a question to actually all the members of the panel. Just a thought on where the balance lies between trying to change the way people travel, change the way they behave. And quite a lot of the conversations has been around on the provision side, about dealing with the providers, local authorities, central government. Just get a thought from all of you on the balance between fixing bus provision and then how much of this needs to be about talking to nudging people into changing their own behaviour, whether or not and it's particularly a question for you, Charles. So whether or not there is more of a role for government to do an old-fashioned thing which used to be called leadership, of just talking to people and encouraging them to think about changing the way they behave. So that's the essay question to discuss. Where's the balance line between fixing provision, fixing the system, and also just changing the way people behave. Who wants to start on that one?
I think I'm going to take that challenge, because you said it was up to us to show leadership, so I shall.
Vote Vere.
Yes, vote Vere.
This is where it starts.
Yes. So no, I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think we have to be careful not to put things into too many different buckets here. I think we need a demand-led service provision. I think buses is supremely well placed to do that, because you can change it relatively quickly and cheaply versus things like heavy rail. And I think we need to be very much about the carrot and the nudge, not the stick. I don't think sticks are going to particularly work in this area. And the other thing, it should be about show, not tell. We could have an advertising campaign which goes out there and tells everybody, take the bus because it's really good for your carbon emissions. And everyone will go, yawn. What I want to do is to have lovely zero emission buses driving along bus priority, and all the cars, people sit in their cars, look at it and go, wow, that's really cool. And then they want to get on the bus. So that's it, because one of the things I'm always concerned about reducing carbon emissions, I'm going to be frank with you, is a lot of people don't see government carbon, they can't touch it, they can't feel it. It's a thing, it's a concept, but it's not easily graspable by local people. And therefore, I always think that the additional thing we should talk about is improved air quality, reduced noise, many of the things actually that were brought up in the report. So I think it's really about showing, not necessarily telling. I don't want to be too big brother about this and nanny state, but I do think that if we provide the funding to local authorities, to ambitious local authorities, then that will all fall out naturally.
This is not an interview, so I'm not going to say what I think of what you just said about public information campaign, but I'm going to get Graham to respond on that demand side question.
Yeah, thank you. So look, as the report says, there's a balance to be struck between carrots, sticks, and nudges. Carrots are expensive, sticks are politically difficult, and nudges therefore are an essential part of the solution. And if you just think about your own lived experience, sort of think about my experience. If I go out and use the bus, in order to do it, I've got to walk past my car, which is parked outside the house. I'm faced with a bus fare, which is obvious and transparent, and I have to pay in the moment. Whereas the costs of motoring are pretty much completely hidden from me on any individual journey. So it's that sort of behavioural framing that you need to overcome. And I might just digress for a moment, if I may, James. I used to work in the world of pensions before I joined the wonderful world of buses and coaches. And we faced a huge, stonking, great behavioural problem there as well. Everybody knew they needed to put money aside for their own retirement, but nobody ever did it. And that was because you had to take action. You had to join a pension scheme and give up some of your hard-earned cash in order for it to work. So what we collectively did between government and industry was just switch that equation around. Everybody got automatically enrolled in a pension, and you were in it unless you left. And guess what? Almost nobody did. A huge public policy success story, and I think it's a change in the framing, a change in the defaults, a change in what it's easy to do on that sort of scale that could really unlock some potential in this sector as well.
Go forward and up and tell us how we default people on the buses.
Well, that's the
we'll do that next question. Hello, where are you on this? On nudges, carrots, sticks, other vegetable-based interventions?
Yeah, I mean, I actually do largely, in fact, totally agree with everything that's been said about not pushing people too hard. And there's people don't like being told not to drive. I think we all know that. There's quite a strong lobby on the other side that's kind of, pushing if you tell people not to drive, then it means that they're taking away our freedom. So we just have to be really careful about framing that whole conversation. I think we can't ask people to switch if the alternative isn't good enough and isn't better, or at least as good as what the original option is. So if we're going to ask people or nudge people towards choosing buses, it has to be a better alternative and cheaper and more accessible and a nicer experience than sitting in your private car, probably will be in a traffic jam. The one disagreement I had was that I don't think it's fair to say that people won't respond to nudges on climate specifically, because people do actually really care about climate change and do look to make sustainable choices where they can. But I think it fits in the same bucket of you can't ask people to do it if it's not better than before. So you can't nudge without good alternative. And things like, providing information about services, availability, to me that's nudge behaviour, which is a kind of, that has to come from local authorities and government as well.
Thank you very much. Now you've provided the question on this. You talked about your report. You ever have to let us know?
I agree with everyone. But one thing I would add, I think there's a moment for change now. In that, if you think about the cost of living crisis, I bought my car recently and cried. It's this is a really big opportunity which we may not see again potentially. So just doing something, not talking about this, actually go out trying to do something fairly quickly, I think is going to be really important here.
Thank you. Thank you. And before I open questions to the audience, I have questions from the audience. Hands up on the bus here. No, that's not the bus. And hands up, who drove the car on last week? Oh, thank you.
your bus in the last week, does that count?
Yeah,
I've got the train here.
Oh,
I haven't got, so
Oh, okay. Just checking. I'll ask for receipts, don't worry. I'll ask the panel to tell us what their favourite bus routes later on, but anyway, we'll now open up to the audience. Who would like to ask you, lady in front, first hand up, if you tell us who you are, and if you can, I have a horror of speech with plenty of questions, so if you can, please do ask a question.
it's Sarah Gayton, I'm with the National Federation of the Blind of the UK. There is a real problem with the conflict between active travel cycle lanes that have been put in that are actually separating the pavement from the bus stop. This isn't an anti-cyclist issue, it's about creative design that we have to fundamentally protect access to a bus straight from the pavement. We have to come up with a different design to stop the cyclists when the buses are coming in, because our members can only take buses, they can't drive, they can't cycle, and they are being, but they can't even get the bus anymore. So
And the question arising from that
the
is,
question is, we need to have, can we halt the active travel, investment going in to ensure every scheme that goes in ensures direct access from the pavement to the bus, so the cycle lanes can go in, but they have to
yes.
bus access. So can we
Speaking as someone who nearly got killed by a cyclist stepping over the valley of death onto a bus step on Balham High Road the weekend, I strongly agree with that point. I'm a neutral chair, so I shouldn't show my hand. Minister, what do you think about ensuring access from the pavement to buses while also promoting cycle transport?
Yes, so it's a very live issue. I know that. I'm not the cycling and walking minister, so I'm going to slightly swerve it. Because I don't know where we are. I don't have an update on where we are in terms of protecting, making sure we have good investment in active travel, but also making sure that we can get people onto buses. Obviously, we have LTM 120, and I'm not entirely sure what the guidance is within LTM 120 about cycle lanes and how they conflict with bus stops. So I'm going to slightly swerve it at this time.
Graham, have you any wider thoughts on that bigger question of which there's buses, I'm going to dissolve it down to buses versus cycles, but there's the issues, unpack the issues involved in that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the critical thing really is that it's about how local authorities integrate their investment decisions and their planning decisions. And we had some challenges during the pandemic where some local authorities spent money on active travel much earlier than we were able to spend it on other modes through the Emergency Active Travel Fund. It was called, I think, that caused some issues of conflict between modes, but I know that government has recognised very clearly now that local authorities, through their local transport plans, need to be planning the provision for all modes at the same time, so try and avoid some of those very real difficulties that you talked about there, Sarah. So I think that's the way to tackle it, really, through those integrated local transport plans.
I was actually going to say exactly what Graham said. There's an opportunity right now because of what's happening with local transport plan guidance to really integrate local planning guidance to address exactly these problems. And I think so far there hasn't been enough join up. So hopefully, fingers crossed going forward, that will be addressed.
Thank you. Then we have the lady in the red top there, and then I'll come back to the gentleman to us behind it.
I'm Sylvia Barrett from Environmental Transport. A couple of questions, if I may, to the Minister. One is on the visit allocations. You mentioned that authorities that did not receive funding, that was 60% of all authorities, were not ambitious enough. We've done some analysis of funding allocations for other pots or competitive pots of funding as well. And we found that there's a bit of a trend that those that are perhaps smaller, with smaller transport teams or more rural, tend to not receive as much funding as those that are perhaps more urban and providing better value for money, presumably for the public investment. My question is, are those sort of less ambitious authorities exactly the ones that need the funding to level up their ambitions, to make sure that they can provide at least a baseline of good service, bus services in the areas if people are to make that switch? And my second question, if I may, is about the end of recovery funding. In October, local operators and authorities were asked to submit service reviews to make sure that services are sustainable. Are we in danger of seeing significant bus cuts come October, and will that align with potential to preserve services for when the promotion hopefully comes into place and we see greater demand for services?
Thank you. Ministry, we get thoughts from you on those, and then I'll try and widen up those the wider issues that were raised in the panel.
Yes, but I think this is one of the challenges of our time, isn't it? Is that, you know, we rely on local transport authorities to deliver pretty much, you know, a vast majority of the things that the Department of Transport does. And a number of people have raised local transport plans, and you know, we know that 61% of local authorities have not updated their local transport plans since 2011. On a scale of rubbishness, that's really hard. You know, so what my concern is that, you know, local authorities have deprioritised the planning of integrated transport networks within their communities. And I think they really need to see now, and I think they are beginning to see that actually having a good local transport plan is the basis for everything else that you can do. And so Helena was right in that there will be guidance later on this year. We will include in that, you know, all of the things that have already been set out in all of our visions that we've already published. So going back to Sarah's point, there's all sorts of things within the National Bus Strategy about bus stops and accessibility, and the government only funding buses that have audio-visual information on it. So there's all sorts of things that are already out there. And now it's up to us to draw it all together into the guidance to make sure that local transport authorities have a good plan. Because without a good plan for transport, how are you going to get any economic growth? How are you going to plan your housing? How are you going to do all of the things that you need to do locally? But what we do recognise is that various places have hollowed out their capability and capacity in specifically in transport planning. We have provided quite a fair amount of funding so far, 2.6 million pounds on local transport plans, 23 million pounds on BSIP, and an amount which is escaped me on cycling and walking. So you can see there's lots of money going in there. We need them to build their own capability and capacity. The government can help by doing regional centres of excellence, encouraging via national transport bodies, the different local authorities to have a chat and learn from each other. But in terms of, you know, who didn't get stuff? I mean, you know, obviously it was a very difficult decision to have to make. 31 out of 79 local transport authorities got BSIP funding, and 41 out of 79 have had funding for buses in general. But what I say to those places that didn't get funding is keep going regardless on the stuff that doesn't need money, because you've got the passenger charter, you need to safeguard existing bus priority, you need to think about your relationship with your operators and putting in place your enhanced partnership. There's a lot that can be done. And I would also say, and this, we did it right out and we said this, should any funding become available in the future, there won't be another competitive bidding process, because a BSIP is there, it's for the future, it should be updated, it's not a one-off document. But those places that have continued to live their ambition and actually deliver will be the places that we prioritise if the funding comes available. So there's an awful lot, you know, going on in this area. We recognise that we have to work really closely with local transport authorities. Not all of them are brilliant, and that's why we're very focused, my team's very focused on lifting those people and those places that at the moment are less good.
That's really, I don't know if you've got anyone here from the government. I suspect someone might counter that there's an issue here around overall resourcing, whether or not you know, over the last 10 years or so, we've had the, you know, the capacity to fully fund their non-statutory, you know, functions here. But for the record, for balance, I open it up to the rest of the panel to see what thoughts they have on local authority capacity engagement, and to quote Charlotte, their rubbishness. How much rubbishness is there out there? How can we have a net reduction in local authorities rubbishness?
So I don't have a local authority rubbish index to hand, I'm afraid, but you know, sure we can make it clear. Maybe that's our next task. Yeah, but clearly there are various levels of capacity and capability across the 79, 80 local authorities in England. But what we want to be very clear about is that a national bus strategy has to be national. And if there are problems at the local authority level that are getting in the way of passengers and potential passengers in that place benefiting from improvements, they need to be fixed. And whether it's through the measures that the Minister has outlined or something additional, that needs to happen. And just thinking about the forthcoming transition of government, new Prime Minister, by the time the new Prime Minister comes in, we might just have seen the first investment flowing from that initial round of PSIPs, the 1.2 billion that's gone into that first round of PSIPs. And our very clear message to the incoming government is going to be, this job has only just started. The job of implementing the National Bus Strategy has only just started. We need to make sure that it's a success in the places which have been fortunate so far, and we need to use the example of those places, backed inevitably by more funding. There will need to be more funding to roll out those successes to the rest of the country. And that, it might not be number one in the incoming Prime Minister's introductory speech, but that vital local transport issue needs to be very high up in the government's priorities.
No rubbish on that. Sorry, I promised the gentleman in the blue shirt there a question. Now come down here first.
My name is Martin Dean from the Go Group, which runs around 5,500 buses around England. Just to follow on from Sylvia's point about ambition and lack of it, there was a Transport Act passed in 2000, so 22 years ago, which gave transport authorities the ability to implement road pricing and workplace parking levies in their areas. Do you think transport authorities have lacked ambition and not been radical enough, given the fact that this has been on the books for such a long period of time, with very, very few transport authorities taking up that option, particularly in the context of encouraging mode switching? Thank you.
Lack of ambition. So I can get Graham and Helena to talk about, and then come to the Minister last on that. I think it would be this time for variety. So Graham, lack of ambition on transport sectors.
I don't know whether it's a lack of ambition or a lack of bravery or lack of confidence, but there's certainly a lack, Martin. And I think if you look around at the extent to which the powers in that act have been capitalised on, it's insufficient. There's much more that can be done. And having said I don't know which it is, I actually think a lot of it's about bravery and a lot of it's about taking the tough political decision, which by and large, people locally will buy into if you explain to them carefully why you're doing it and the benefits that will flow from it. But that's a very tough political decision to take. And I do think, and this is a topic that the Minister and I have discussed before, that some leadership from central government is necessary here in terms of pointing out the direction that we want to move in collectively, doing a little bit more travel by private car and a little more travel by sustainable modes, including bus and coach, and some of those modes which will benefit from things like workplace parking levies.
On that point, sorry, just briefly interrupting. You've raised road pricing. I should just briefly emphasise the SMF's work on road pricing. So we've done quite a lot of work on national road pricing, and I just wanted to point out, if anybody wasn't watching the liaison committee last week in the dying days of Boris Johnson's government, the Prime Minister, as he still is, actually conceded under questioning from Hugh Baron, yes, eventually, sooner or later, a government is going to have to introduce a system of national road pricing to replace the lost revenue from fuel duty, which is something that all politicians know has to happen. It's just that nobody ever says so when they're running for office. So just slightly sad indictment that only his dying days in office did our current Prime Minister actually acknowledge something everyone knows to be true. But that's something that will be on our agenda for the next government, to try and get the next lot to admit that slightly earlier in their tenure. Helen, before your thoughts from you on that before we come to Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised road pricing more as a whole, because it is something Treasury is going to have massive black holes. We transition to electric vehicles. There are many ways that a road pricing, road user charging scheme could be introduced. There are lots of equity considerations, fairness considerations. You know, do you charge just electric vehicles, just combustion vehicles, a combination? So, like, we could get into a really deep discussion about that now, but that's not what we're here for. Just on local authority ambition, I think, it was raised by Sylvia, the kind of resource question probably plays into it a little bit. And I also agree with Graham that it's maybe a question as well of communication and understanding what is actually possible. And perhaps it weirdly has maybe actually worked out in favour, not having lots of like a bit of a patchwork of road pricing that will be really complicated for local authorities and treasury and users. So accelerating towards a national road pricing scheme actually will probably be easier for everybody. So it might weirdly have worked out for the better, but we never know.
Charles, to paraphrase the question and the previous your contributors, you said local authorities aren't ambitious enough, everyone else says you're not ambitious enough. Who's here? Who's right?
Of course, we're ambitious enough. We're
Excellent.
uber ambitious.
So you'll now be announcing a national road pricing scheme.
And I will not currently today be announcing a national road pricing scheme.
Not today, eh?
No. I want to do something. But I think, I think sometimes we forget about the transport decarbonisation plan. That was and is a very ambitious document. And in it, we very clearly state that we want to see modal shift to public and private travel. And I think one of the issues that I think will bring it home to local authorities very soon, and I'm very sorry to come back to this is the local transport plans, they will be expected to put in their local transport plans their quantifiable carbon. And therefore they will have to have routes to reduce their carbon. So all of a sudden, I think the chickens are going to come home to roost, and they're going to look at this and say, well, how on earth are we going to do this unless we start doing something, in terms of the shifting to public transport. And of course, what we're doing with the BSIS will help that, because when any area gets its money, it will be required to publish patronage, etc., every 6 months. So we'll be able to see which areas are delivering and which outcomes are having the biggest impact. So actually, you're going to have 3 things. You're going to need to reduce your quantifiable carbon. You're going to have the evidence from other local authorities that are like you and doing things that you might gain from. And then I think the third thing we really, really need to do is to focus on elected members, because sometimes you will have the local authority officers who completely get it. Sometimes the elected members may not 100% get it. And so certainly from our perspective about the way that we're trying to share best practice, we're very much scooping in the elected members too, because we need them to love buses as much as we do.
Thank you very much. I think the gentleman down here is putting up the last question, which I'm sure will be admirably crisp and brief, followed by extremely concise answers from the panels.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Lawrence Green. I'm an economist at DFT. My question to the panel is do we envisage a specific role for coach services? Also, most of the discourse has been about bus service division at the moment and certain carrots and sticks with BSIPs and national bus strategy. Do we still see bus and coach services in tandem, or do we envisage as a specific role for coaches?
Buses or coaches, buses and coaches. Lovely. Right, and that will go. I'm going to go from left to right. Helen Graham, the final word from Minister. No, sorry, Matt, unless you have strong views on coaches.
I do, but others they are strong ones.
Good.
So the most amount of emissions when it comes to cars come from long distance journeys, and buses, especially in kind of local urban areas, are really important, but they don't address emissions in the same way that long distance journeys need to be addressed, and that's where coaches come in, especially kind of intercity. And I mean, I only ever travel exclusively by coach when I'm a student because it's so much cheaper than the train, and I can imagine across the country still doing that now. So I think a really, really important role to play. And I don't think we're talking about coaches enough, and we're just writing skewed massively towards buses, I think just because of the number of people that use them. But if you look from an emissions point of view, coaches have a huge role to play as well in displacing those journeys.
Thank you, Graham. Coaches, buses, and discourse as well. It's a good question to discuss.
Great, well, isn't it? All right. Yeah, coaches and buses, absolutely. The report is crystal clear that coaches have a significant role to play as well as buses. So buses save us the equivalent of the northeast of England's carbon emissions. Coaches save us the equivalent of the City of Leeds carbon emissions. So it's got a considerable sum. And when you actually think about it in practical terms, I think when you are trying to improve connectivity between towns and cities, and you're struggling to get the right investment in rail, you're waiting for a rail project to come through, maybe, I think a good hard look at what scheduled coach can do is a really valuable way that those benefits can actually be crystallised and brought to life.
The final word, Minister.
The final word. Yes, God, it's really naughty we didn't cover coaches as well, because we always get told off for not doing that. And I suppose it is because obviously, you know, they're not, they don't get government funding like the buses do. But I completely agree. I think coaches have a huge role to play. I went to visit National Express at Stansted recently, and it's amazing how much they're investing in their new modern vehicles. We know, as Helen said, that they're cheap. Obviously, my children always use the coach because it's so cheap. And we know that they, as Graham said, can reduce carbon emissions. And so, but the issue is it's about choice, isn't it? There's one thing that I think we could do for coach that we do need to focus on, and that's journey time reliability. And so when you come into the urban centres, it's very much about working with probably metro mayors in the big urban centres about, you know, how do we improve journey time reliability. And one of the things that the government's doing that may help with that is key route networks. So by allowing the metro mayors to say to the local authorities that we're gonna look after that road, and therefore they can then put in the sorts of priorities that would make journey time reliability on coach much better. I think that's one of the things the government can do, but we absolutely see that coach has a big future.
Thank you very much. I mean, perfectly brought us into, you know, the time's 13 minutes past 12, which is we're due to wrap up. So with that, I'm going to bring things to a close. Thank all of you for coming. Before you go, on your seat is one of these. Don't leave behind. It's got a code on it which will allow you to go straight to Matt's knowledge report. So it's not, you know, and obviously it tells you all about the CPT. So please do take it away with you. It's effectively the equivalent of the hard copy reports we used to put on seats at these launches many years ago. Please retain that if you can. But all I will the only thing we'll do is ask you all to give a big hand of thanks to our panel today. I say thank you all for coming. I hope to see you again throughout the lifetime of this program. Thank you. As I promised to you.